When I found 3 black garbage bags rotting in my barn, I knew exactly who to blame. Marlene Kirkwood, the queen of our HOA and a grade A menace. I'm Adrian Daniels, and after 15 years of living peacefully on my 2-acre spread, Marlene moved in across the street and immediately declared herself the neighborhood's standard enforcer. It started with passive-aggressive notes about my grass being half an inch too high. Then she complained about my unsightly barn, even though it had been here longer than most of the houses. I mostly ignored her, until the morning I went to feed my horses and nearly tripped over a pile of garbage bags dumped right inside my barn. I stood there, jaw tightening, the sour stench already filling the air. Each bag was stuffed with old party decorations, rotten food, and what looked like broken picture frames. And on one bag, clear as day, was a shipping label addressed to Marlene Kirkwood. I grabbed my phone and snapped a dozen photos from every angle. No way was I letting this slide. Marlene loved to cite every obscure rule in the HOA handbook, but apparently when it came to her own trash, she thought she could treat my barn like a landfill. I waited until the HOA's monthly meeting, knowing she'd be there in full Karen mode, sitting at the front table with her clipboard like she was running a courtroom. As soon as they opened the floor for community concerns, I stood up. "I've got a concern," I said, holding up the printed photos. "Seems someone decided my barn was a public dump." Marlene's face tightened. "Mr. Daniels, if you have a problem, please submit it through the proper channels." "Oh, I'm doing it properly," I cut her off. I handed copies of the photos to every board member. "Here's the evidence." "Addressed to you, Marlene. Care to explain why your garbage is on my property?" The room went dead silent. Marlene's nostrils flared. "That's absurd. I would never." "It's not absurd," I interrupted, keeping my voice even. "It's illegal dumping. And by the way, since you're so fond of HOA rules, I read them. Section 7 says property owners can charge a dumping fee of up to $500 per incident for unauthorized waste on their land." Marlene's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I wasn't finished. "I'm invoicing you for $1,500 for the 3 bags. You've got 10 days to pay, or I'll file a lien through county court." I smiled politely. "I'm sure the neighborhood will love hearing why their HOA fees are going up to cover your personal trash service." Several neighbors chuckled under their breath. Marlene's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. She tried to sputter something, but the board president, who clearly had enough of her antics too, leaned forward. "Miss Kirkwood, you need to settle this immediately. We can't have lawsuits against the HOA because of personal negligence." I folded my arms, watching her squirm. For once, Marlene didn't have a rule to hide behind. Marlene stormed out of the meeting without another word, leaving a trail of whispered gossip in her wake. I stayed seated, watching quietly as the board shuffled papers and pretended not to notice the spectacle. As soon as the meeting adjourned, several neighbors approached me, their faces lit with a mixture of amusement and relief. One of them, a retired fire chief named Leonard, clapped me on the shoulder. His voice was low but firm. "Been waiting a long time for someone to put her in her place," he said. "If you need witnesses, you've got plenty." I nodded, grateful but cautious. Marlene wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Sure enough, the very next morning, a certified letter was taped to my front door. It was from Marlene herself, claiming that I had slandered her good name and demanding a formal apology or she would seek legal recourse for emotional damages. I read the letter twice, then laughed aloud. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. First, I called my cousin, Delia, who worked as a paralegal for a property rights attorney in the next county over. She agreed to help me draft a formal response, citing every relevant law about illegal dumping, private property rights, and the HOA's own bylaws. We added a counterclaim for harassment, backed with the photo evidence and a witness list that had grown to 8 neighbors willing to testify. While Delia worked on the paperwork, I made another call this time to the county sheriff's office. I explained the situation professionally, sticking to the facts. The deputy I spoke with was sympathetic and agreed to send someone out to take a report. Deputy Ramirez showed up that afternoon in a dusty patrol car, taking careful notes as I walked him through everything. He inspected the barn, looked over the photos, and examined the shipping label with Marlene's name and address clearly printed on it. "This is pretty cut and dry," he said. "Technically, it's criminal trespass and illegal dumping. You want to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." Ramirez nodded, pocketing the evidence carefully. "We'll file a formal citation. She'll be summoned to court." By evening, word had already rippled through the neighborhood like wildfire. Marlene's usual supporters, mostly a handful of retirees who liked the idea of a tightly controlled community, started distancing themselves. Apparently, public criminal charges weren't good for the HOA's image. The next few days were strangely quiet. No nasty notes, no phantom complaints about my grass or fencing. Even Marlene's house looked different, curtains drawn tight, her prized flower beds starting to wilt from neglect. It was like she had gone into hiding. On the 10th day, the deadline for my dumping fee invoice, I received a check in the mail. It was made out for exactly $1,500, no note attached. I deposited it immediately, snapping a photo of the endorsed check for my records, but I wasn't done. At the court hearing a week later, Marlene appeared looking disheveled and furious. Her usual crisp pantsuit was replaced with a wrinkled blouse and skirt, and she clutched a stack of papers in trembling hands. She tried to argue that she had been framed, that someone must have stolen her trash and planted it in my barn to discredit her leadership. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp glasses and an impatient tone, wasn't buying it. "You admit the garbage came from your residence?" she asked. Marlene faltered. "Well, yes, but then you are responsible for its disposal," the judge said curtly. "Guilty of misdemeanor trespass and illegal dumping, fined $2,000 and court costs. Next case." I barely suppressed my satisfaction as Marlene gaped like a fish again, her face pale. The clerk handed her a sheet listing her fines and an order to perform 20 hours of community service. I caught a glimpse of her assignment: litter cleanup along the county highway. Outside the courthouse, Leonard and a few others were waiting. They didn't cheer or laugh, they just gave me nods of approval, the kind that said, "You did what needed doing." I thought that would be the end of it, but Marlene wasn't done self-destructing. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at every house in the neighborhood. A desperate letter from Marlene, accusing me of orchestrating a campaign of harassment against her. She called for an emergency HOA election to restore order and dignity. Bad move. Turns out, the HOA rules required a petition signed by at least 60% of residents to call a special election. Instead, within 48 hours, a different petition circulated, one calling for Marlene's immediate removal from the HOA board altogether. Once again, Leonard took the lead. He and a few others spent an afternoon knocking on doors, gathering signatures. People who had never spoken at meetings before were eager to sign. Stories poured out how Marlene had fined a widow for having a ceramic deer on her lawn, how she threatened to sue a family for letting their kids draw chalk art on the sidewalk, how she tried to ban backyard vegetable gardens because they looked too rural. By the end of the week, 90% of the neighborhood had signed. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was electric. Chairs scraped loudly as people filed in, packing the room fuller than I had ever seen it. Marlene sat stiffly at the head table, flanked by 2 remaining loyalists who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Leonard stood and presented the petition. "The community has spoken," he said. "We demand a vote tonight." The board president, who had grown increasingly weary of Marlene's antics, didn't even hesitate. "All in favor of removing Miss Kirkwood from the HOA board, raise your hand." Every hand shot up except for Marlene's and her 2 lackeys. The president banged the gavel. Motion passed. Effective immediately. Marlene pushed back her chair so hard it scraped the floor, grabbed her purse, and stormed out. This time, nobody followed. The board quickly moved to elect a new member, Leonard, by unanimous decision, and voted to establish a new rule. Any HOA official caught abusing their power would be permanently barred from holding office again. As the meeting wound down, a few neighbors approached me, grinning. "You know," said Mrs. Patterson, a soft-spoken retired teacher, "we ought to name the barn Fort Daniels after all this. I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in months. The next morning, someone left a hand-painted sign by my mailbox. It read, "Welcome to Fort Daniels where justice lives." I left it up. After all, it was my property, and thanks to a few well-documented photos, a little legal know-how, and a neighborhood tired of being pushed around, it was finally going to stay that way. 3 weeks after Marlene's removal, the neighborhood felt like a different place. Kids rode bikes without parents glaring nervously over their shoulders. People planted gardens without worrying about citations. And a few neighbors even organized a Saturday cookout at the community park, something Marlene had once banned for being too chaotic. But just when I thought the dust had fully settled, something else surfaced. It started innocently enough. Leonard and I were helping Mrs. Patterson repair her fence when she waved us over, a thick manila envelope clutched in her hand. "I wasn't sure what to do with this," she said, her voice low. "It was wedged behind my mailbox, no postage, looks important." Leonard took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of financial statements from the HOA's account. Line after line of unauthorized expenses leapt off the pages. Luxury spa visits, catering bills for private parties, and even a suspicious consulting fee paid to a company that, according to a quick search Leonard did on his phone, didn't exist. My stomach tightened. Marlene hadn't just been annoying. She had been siphoning money from the HOA treasury. Leonard handed the papers to me. She wasn't just power-hungry, she was robbing everybody blind. I flipped through the documents, noting the dates. Most of the charges lined up with periods when Marlene had been most vocal about raising HOA fees. She had claimed the neighborhood needed beautification projects and a security patrol projects no one had ever seen materialize. "These are criminal charges," I said. "We need to take this to the authorities." Leonard agreed, and we drove straight to the county sheriff's office, where we asked to speak to a detective. Within an hour, we were sitting across from Detective Harlow, a woman with a sharp gaze and a notebook already open in front of her. She listened carefully as we explained everything, handing over the copies Mrs. Patterson had found. When we finished, she tapped her pen against the table. "You're not the first HOA to run into embezzlement, but this is extensive. If these documents are legitimate, we're talking about grand theft." She leaned back in her chair. "I'll need the original financial records, not just copies. Do you know where they would be?" Leonard nodded. "They should be in the HOA's office. Marlene had a storage unit where she kept all the records. She mentioned it once at a meeting." Detective Harlow's eyes gleamed. "Perfect. I'll get a search warrant." 2 days later, the sheriff's office executed the warrant on the storage unit Marlene had rented under the HOA's name. What they found was worse than we had imagined. Inside were boxes stuffed with receipts, expense reports, and bank statements. Some of them confirmed the luxury purchases we had seen. Others revealed even more. Marlene had used HOA funds to pay for a private gym membership, a weekend resort stay, and high-end home renovations, including a new kitchen she had boasted about at the last Christmas party. The evidence piled up quickly, and within a week, Marlene was arrested. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had been too afraid to speak up before now came forward with their own stories. How Marlene had pressured them into paying bogus fines, how she had threatened to report minor code violations if they didn't comply with her demands. At the preliminary hearing, Marlene looked nothing like the imperious woman who had once lorded over HOA meetings. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes rumpled. She stood before the judge, her attorney whispering frantically in her ear, but there was no dignity left to salvage. The charges were read aloud: grand theft, fraud, unlawful use of funds, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The judge ordered her held on bail, citing risk of flight. Meanwhile, the new HOA board, led by Leonard, moved swiftly to clean up the mess Marlene had left behind. They hired a professional auditing firm to review all past transactions, and what they found was staggering. Nearly $60,000 had been drained from the HOA account over 3 years. At the next community meeting, Leonard addressed everyone gathered in the park under the pavilion. "We're going to sue her civilly as well," he said. "Every penny she took, we're coming for it." Applause broke out, rippling through the crowd. I stayed toward the back, arms crossed, watching the neighborhood come alive with something it hadn't had in years: hope. Later that week, Detective Harlow stopped by my place to give me an update. She leaned against her cruiser, arms folded. Her lawyer's trying to work out a plea deal, she said, but the DA isn't interested unless she pays full restitution. Given her financial records, that's going to be tough. She's broke, I asked, close to it. She blew most of the money on personal luxuries. She doesn't have much left to show for it. I shook my head. All that greed for what? Harlow shrugged. Some people think power's a license to do whatever they want. They forget it's just a loan. Eventually, someone comes to collect. Before she left, she handed me a copy of the official report, just in case we needed it for the civil case. Meanwhile, the neighborhood wasn't content to just sit around. Leonard organized a volunteer committee to repair the damage Marlene's rain had caused. People donated time, money, and supplies. We rebuilt the community garden she had ordered ripped out. We repainted the park gazebo she had neglected. We even planted a line of oak saplings along the main road, a living reminder that real growth came from community, not control. One afternoon, as I hammered the last plank into a new bench by the playground, Mrs. Patterson approached with a mason jar full of sweet tea. "You know," she said, handing it to me, "this place feels like home again." I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "It's because the right people stood up when it mattered," she smiled, her face crinkling with something close to pride. "You started it, Adrian." I didn't argue. I knew it wasn't just me. It was everyone who refused to be bullied, everyone who had said enough was enough. Weeks later, when Marlene's trial finally took place, the courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled the pews, silent but present, a wall of witnesses to the damage she had caused. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically. Bank records, receipts, testimonies from residents and experts. Marlene's defense attorney tried to paint her as overwhelmed and misguided, but the jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for only 2 hours, they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in state prison, plus full restitution to the HOA. She would be paying for her crimes long after she served her time. As she was led away in handcuffs, she didn't look at any of us. She kept her head down, her shoulders slumped. Outside the courthouse, the mood wasn't one of celebration exactly, but something deeper: closure. Leonard shook my hand firmly. "We took our neighborhood back," he said. I nodded, "and we'll keep it that way." In the months that followed, things only got better. Property values rose, community events flourished, people trusted each other again. And every time I walked past the weathered sign someone had left by my mailbox months ago, "Welcome to Fort Daniels," I smiled. Not because I had one against Marlene, but because we all had. Because sometimes, standing up to the worst brings out the very best in people. The weeks after Marlene's sentencing were busy in a new way. Without her constant interference, the neighborhood finally had room to breathe, but the damage she had left behind was deeper than anyone realized. Aside from the stolen funds, she had signed off on a dozen shady contracts that now needed untangling. One Sunday morning, Leonard showed up at my place with a stack of folders under his arm. "We need to talk," he said, setting them down on my porch table with a heavy thud. I poured him some fresh coffee, and we sat down under the shade of the old oak tree. "The audit turned up something else," Leonard said, flipping open a folder. "There are permits for a drainage project she approved last year. Only problem is, it never happened." I leaned forward, scanning the paperwork. The signatures were all there, including one from a contractor named Daniels and Sons Excavation. I didn't know them, but the name alone felt suspiciously convenient. Leonard tapped the page. "The company isn't real. No business license, no tax ID, nothing. She created a fake vendor to funnel more money out." I let out a low whistle. "How much?" "Just over $30,000. The realization settled like a stone in my gut. "We're going to need the district attorney again." Leonard nodded grimly. "Already called them. They're expanding the case." Later that week, Detective Harlow returned to the neighborhood, this time with 2 other investigators. They worked methodically, interviewing board members, pulling bank records, and seizing Marlene's personal computer from her foreclosed home. Watching them work was oddly satisfying. For so long, Marlene had treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Now the law was pulling apart every lie she had built it on. One afternoon, after the investigators finished up, Leonard and I walked the perimeter of the park, where the new oak saplings were thriving. He stopped by the old community bulletin board, now stripped clean of Marlene's endless lists of petty rules. "We're thinking about starting a real neighborhood association," Leonard said. "One that actually serves people, not controls them." I leaned against the post. "What's the plan?" "No mandatory dues, voluntary contributions only, no random fines, and leadership has to rotate every 2 years." "No more lifetime dictatorships," I nodded approvingly. "Sounds like something worth being part of," he smiled, a genuine one. "We want you on the founding committee." Before I could answer, a car pulled up to the curb. Detective Harlow stepped out, a thick folder tucked under her arm. She joined us by the bulletin board, her expression serious. "We've got everything we need," she said. "The fake contractor scheme, the missing funds, the forged signatures. It's enough to add charges for wire fraud and forgery." Leonard whistled low. "That's federal time, isn't it?" Harlow nodded. "She'll be facing a federal grand jury next month. If convicted, she could be looking at another 10 years. There was a long pause as that sank in. "She built her own prison," I said finally. "We just handed her the bricks." Harlow chuckled quietly. "That you did. Oh, and one more thing." She pulled a small envelope from the folder and handed it to me. Inside was a check issued by the court. It was my share of the restitution Marlene had been ordered to pay, covering the damages from the illegal dumping incident. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover a full renovation of the barn. New doors, fresh paint, better lighting. I tucked the envelope into my back pocket, feeling a weight lift. After Harlow left, Leonard and I lingered by the park. A few kids ran past, laughing, their parents chatting nearby without a hint of the old tension that had once hung over every gathering. "You know," Leonard said, watching them, "this place finally feels like a community again." I grinned. "Took a while and a fight." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Worth every second." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a soft gold, I set to work on the barn. I hadn't touched it much since the day I found those trash bags, but now it felt like the right time. I tore down the old, sagging doors and installed sturdy new ones. I repainted the exterior, choosing a deep, rich red that matched the original color from decades ago. I fixed the roof where a few shingles had come loose and added a new weather vane shaped like a horse, spinning gently in the breeze. Neighbors stopped by as I worked, offering help and spare parts. Someone brought a case of cold sodas. Someone else dropped off a box of fresh nails and screws. No one asked for anything in return. By the end of the week, the barn looked better than it had in years. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol. On Saturday afternoon, we held a small gathering in front of it. Leonard gave a short speech, thanking everyone for standing together. Mrs. Patterson brought a homemade apple pie. Kids ran around with kites, their laughter filling the air. When it got dark, someone lit a bonfire and we sat around it, swapping stories and making plans for the future. No one mentioned Marlene. She was old news now, a bad chapter finally closed. At one point, Leonard raised his cup in a quiet toast. "To Fort Daniels," he said, "and to a neighborhood that knows how to fight back." The others joined in, their voices strong and sure. I leaned back in my chair, watching the flames dance against the night sky, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Real peace, earned the hard way. Later, as I walked home under the stars, the new barn standing proudly behind me, I thought about everything we had been through. The threats, the lies, the battles. And how, in the end, it hadn't been about rules or power or even revenge. It had been about standing up for what was right, no matter how long it took. It had been about choosing community over control, choosing courage over fear. Choosing to fight, not just for ourselves, but for each other. And as I locked up the barn for the night, the sturdy new doors closing with a satisfying click, I knew one thing for certain. If anyone ever tried to take that away again, they'd find this neighborhood ready to stand together. Ready to fight back, ready to win.